All right, everyone. Welcome to another conversation here on Esoterica. One of the things I really love about this channel is it gives me an excuse to talk to super smart, specialized folks. And one of the things that I'm really interested in and done some content before is on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'm very honored to welcome Dr. Kip Davis, also here on YouTube, to Esoterica. Good to see you, Kip. Thank you.
Wow, it's great to be here, Justin. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a
Absolutely.
big fan.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. We were talking off camera about all kinds of Dead Sea Scroll minutia, so we're going to get into some of it today. Kip,
Excited.
you mind just sort of telling us a little bit about yourself? Your what you're working on, what your background is, what your specializations are, and also where folks can find you.
Sure. So, my name is Kip Davis. I am a biblical scholar and a specialist in early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls. My narrow specialization is scribal practices and paleography and manuscript construction. And I'm very interested in questions with regards to the Bible, the reception history of the text in the earliest stages that we can actually access through the manuscripts. And the Dead Sea Scrolls have an awful lot
Hmm.
to continue to tell us about that. So most of my work tends to be in that direction. The stuff that I've been working on most recently academically has to do with material philology and how this can help us in help to inform us with regards to questions that we have concerning the shapes of manuscripts and what they have to tell us about the function and usage of texts in antiquity. So yeah, and I am on YouTube. You can just find me by my channel is my name, Kip Davis, and I make a lot of content geared towards critical biblical scholarship generally, and just trying to help people to understand what the Bible is, where it came from, and why it's so cool. Because it is. It's just a fundamentally uh, monumentally interesting text, and it's an important text because of how much it has affected and continues to affect certainly the modern Western world in which so many of us can continue to live. So that's a lot of what I do. And I'll say one more thing. I have a dedicated long form series about the Dead Sea Scrolls that I've been working on for a while. And yeah, if you're interested in a just a really deep dive on a lot of questions with regards to the scrolls themselves, I've got a lot of information there.
That's fantastic. You say paleography, that my ears perk up as a calligrapher. So
Oh wow, yeah.
we can sit down and hash out a 2 hour debate, folks. This is actually just going to be a 2 hour debate about
That's
the
it.
line between
About
formal and semi formal Herodian, and
oh,
and
don't get me started.
we'll get Ava Gardini in here and then we'll hash it out. Yeah, this is paleography nerds. I love that stuff. I love that stuff. Well, yeah, folks, check out Dr. Davis's channel on YouTube. And again, I think that for folks who are interested in sort of esoterica adjacent stuff, like I don't know, the Book of Enoch, right? Famously
Yeah.
recovered in Aramaic fragments and in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I think, folks, if you're interested in Nag Hammadi, you'll be interested in the Dead Sea
Mhm.
Scrolls, the War Scroll, and other kinds of apocalyptic texts like that, or just War Scrolls, I should say. There's more than one.
Yeah, there
Um,
is.
so big misconceptions, right? We're not going to talk about what the
Yeah.
Dead Sea Scrolls are. Anyone watching this channel, you should know what the Dead Sea Scrolls are. You should have a video, things like that. But what are some not the normal big conceptions, misconceptions, right? Like, oh, that there's a fragment of the Gospel of Mark or something over there. But what are some of the more I don't know what the right word is, the deep cut misconceptions
The
about the Dead
deep
Sea
cut
Scrolls, or any
misconception.
that jump to your mind that you really would like,
Yeah.
"Hey, look, this is the ones we
So,
need to put to bed," but also maybe some more deep cut,
I mean,
misconceptions.
I can think of several.
Okay.
right off the top of my head. And there's different directions we can go here, right? Because there's different places where you encounter the Dead Sea Scrolls, which promote different sorts of misconceptions. I mean, right from the get go, a lot of people. It's almost like it's almost like a magic word, a magic term, Dead Sea Scrolls. I think in large part because it sounds cool, you know, it
Hmm.
sounds mysterious and there's a mystique to it. And lots in lots of places they lean into this, in the Ancient Aliens crowd, the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us everything we need to know about the Anakim, right? Who came to Earth, and so there's and there's silly stuff like that, right?
But
But
there is a Book
then
of Giants recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls.
yeah,
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. And it's hella interesting.
Yeah. Really interesting.
And that I think that's it's nice that you brought that up because I think this sort of feeds into another misconception we have about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that while the Dead Sea Scrolls remain our best earliest resource for the shape on and the text of the biblical texts, they also have really muddied the waters
Mm.
in terms of what we even do with this question of the Bible. What is it? Where did it come from? What did it look like at the time of Jesus? Most of the people that I tend to speak to in my audience come from a are Christians or come out of a Christian background, so it's always about Jesus, right? But you know, uh, in terms of probably one of the biggest misconceptions and the one that really sticks in my craw are questions concerning the Bible and what the Dead Sea Scrolls can and should tell us about the Bible. For a long time, uh, people have continued to promote this idea that the Dead Sea Scrolls have established the text, the reliability of the text of the Bible, that they were kind of a miracle in terms of illustrating just the fastidiousness of scribes stretching all the way back into antiquity in such a way that they provide confidence to um, believers and very sincere religious people about the accuracy of their texts. And while one of the things that happens is because there's a lot of individual copies of so-called biblical texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, that's potentially true. But then you have to be really selective in terms of what you're even looking at in the manuscripts. And this leads to another misconception. When people think about the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think they think that we've got like lots of intact
Right.
scrolls, kicking around. No, we have, you know, certainly at least one out of hundreds. We have at least one completely intact scroll. It's maybe the most famous one, the Great Isaiah
Right.
Scroll. There might be a few more, or there's certainly, a couple that are close to intact, but the vast, vast majority of the content that we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls are fragments,
Mm.
and most of them are really small. There are tens of thousands of them, and the kind of work that scholars have been doing on them for the past nearly 80 years now, since they have been discovered, has been the painstaking labor of putting these fragments together and trying to sort out even what they look like. And as a result, for a long time, you'll see statements made, for example, about how important a book like the Book of Isaiah was for the writers and the collectors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because there were 22 copies of the book of Isaiah. I'm using my scare quotes here. I have to scare quote all the time when I'm talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are 22 copies of the book of Isaiah, and people have in their mind that, we have these,
Right.
these
22 rolls,
Isaiah
complete rolls. Yeah.
22 rolls kicking around, when no, that's not what we have. And when you actually dig into this question a little more, you discover that some of these so-called copies of the book of Isaiah consist of like a fragment or two.
Right.
um, so we don't know, like, what is this? Is this the book of Isaiah? I don't know. It could be. It makes me skeptical just by virtue of the fact that this is all we have left of it. Um, but then it also raises questions about what even the book of Isaiah is, because one of the interesting things that we discover when we look into these 22 copies of the book of Isaiah is that most of them, even ones that look like they where we have multiple fragments that look like they survive from larger scrolls, even these are like just the first half of the
Hmm.
book of Isaiah, or the second half of the book of Isaiah. I think one of the really exciting things that the scrolls have helped to communicate to us about the Bible is in this direction, right? That a lot of these texts, as late as the first century BCE, were still being negotiated and edited and compiled on a pretty large scale. Like, they're not just correcting, words and sentences and stuff. They're still in the process of putting together um, these prophecies that eventually came together to form the book of Isaiah. But this is still an ongoing process as late as the first century BCE.
Hmm.
We have evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls for the ongoing construction of something like the book of Daniel. Like, it just so sorry, I rattled on there for a long time
No, no, no. I
about.
think you're pointing to a very important point, is that not only is the Bible not a book, it's a library, and it
Yeah.
wasn't even a library that was put into one house, so to speak, by this time period. Even the individual books are still coming into existence. And to your point about the question of distribution of what manuscripts are there and which ones aren't, of course, Esther's famously not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yep.
But if we're thinking about canon, whatever canon is, of course, this is a much later concept. If we're going to use distribution models as a way of establishing what was canonical, then we're going to put Jubilees and Enoch in there,
Yeah, we are. And we're
because there's
probably
more
gonna have to
copies of
take
them
some
than
things.
Exodus.
We're gonna have to take some things out, right?
Sure, right.
By the same measure. Like if you're putting Jubilees and Enoch into your canon, and then also, depending on how you're structuring your models, there's a bunch of other texts too, like instruction,
Right.
or the Aramaic Levi document, or some of these ones that they really seem to like.
Hmm.
But then what are you taking out? Like, sure, there might be a couple of copies of the book of Joshua in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or Judges, um, or Chronicles, or Kings. They don't seem to have had much use for the Deuteronomistic history.
Right.
So and that is, I mean, that's probably, I mean, that could be a third of your entire book. Like, if you're, from a Jewish perspective, that's like a third of your entire Bible,
Right.
basically.
And
Uh,
this is to the point of the fact that what in the why in the world would we prioritize one sect who is admittedly uh, probably on the outskirts of normative Judaisms, if we think of the
mhm.
Pharisees and Sadducees and those guys, these were self-selected people who chose to opt out of mainstream Judaisms. And it's like if we found the a very strange library at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco and decided that that was where we're going to build the Bible around. Like most Christians, we like those guys are kind of strange. There are even the guys out there following a 365-day calendar. At least it
Yeah,
seems like, right? That they weren't even
yeah,
celebrating Yom Kippur and other holidays on the same day the other Jews at the time were. They were quite that odd. So it would seem like it's a weird flex for some apologists to say, well, this text of Isaiah matches up to this other text of Isaiah in the Masoretic text, and therefore we're right. I'm like, you're picking the Masoretic text, which is a somewhat odd text and late, and you're picking a text produced by a sect that probably isn't what you would think or orthodox in any sense of the word. And then you're saying, well, because their stuff agrees with our stuff, therefore it's a weird. The
It
logic of
really
that is
is.
a bizarre. It's
We
always struck me as a weird logic.
we talked about this off camera about how strange it is, on the one hand, that that certain people and certain groups really want to prioritize the Masoretic text.
Hmm.
It certainly, I mean, there's an historical rationale as to why the Masoretic text survived as the text within modern Judaism, right? Um, but like, why on earth do Protestant, evangelical, conservative Christians care so much about this text, uh, when there's other, I would say there's other directions that they could go which make more historical faithful sense to Christian tradition
Sure,
in terms
Septuagint.
of, right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's
Uh
that's what the New Testament writers were reading. They didn't care about them. The Masoretic text
no,
was 1,000 years out.
exactly. So, but then this raises another really critical point about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and maybe this is also a misconception. Uh, so, not only, yes, we found, now, we're constantly in danger of falling into anachronisms whenever we
Mhm,
talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Bible. But we have quite a number of manuscripts which have been designated as, the correct term is Proto-Masoretic, on the basis of the fact that they do look an awful lot like the proper Masoretic texts that we know through later medieval manuscripts. But these are clearly not identical, and they dramatically predate that. So it's difficult to attach this label, but it's close, right? It seems to be that this is the family of texts out of which this tradition eventually emerged, and those, yes,
mhm,
we have those in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that's not all we have.
right.
We've got manuscripts, and this is really exciting and really interesting. We only knew about the Septuagint for the longest time through the Greek, the proper Greek translations of the Hebrew texts that were preserved by Christian communities for hundreds of years. And one of the I actually remember meeting. I was still a grad student. I met a pastor once who found out, kind of what I was working on, what I did. And he said to me, he's like, I have a question for you. He says, and something that has just bothered me for a long time is, can you explain to me why the Septuagint got everything so wrong? And this is, for a long
Yeah,
time, people had this perspective, right? That this is just because Christians are dumb and can't read Hebrew, they just, they just mess this up that badly. Which is a failure to recognize what's going on with so much of the Septuagint. Yes, no question. Those early Greek translators, a lot of them knew Hebrew better than others, and you encounter some things when you read the Greek text of the Bible, and you go, wow, like they're really fighting to try and figure out even what the Hebrew text is
mhm,
saying as they're translating it into Greek. There's better translators in certain places, but one of the things that we came to discover even before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that actually the Septuagint is most likely, is certainly another version
right.
of, the text for a number of biblical books. The
And
book of
preserves
Jeremiah.
readings better than the
Mu
Masoretic text does in some
Better,
cases.
earlier,
Yeah, earlier, yeah.
yes. One of the really exciting things about what was discovered with the Dead Sea Scrolls are copies of Hebrew texts, which now look a lot like what was behind
Hmm.
these Greek translations, this Septuagint. So, like, and then on top of that, there's, the Samaritan Pentateuch, this other large stream of text tradition for which we now also have very early manuscripts coming out of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the fact that all of this stuff is represented within this, this one library, to say nothing for, and this is what one of the things that I've spent quite a bit of time in my own work and my own research, investigating this question with regards to individual text traditions and how we're classifying and compartmentalizing a lot of these manuscripts. You start to come up against some other things, like the so-called rework Pentateuch, which one of the editors, Emmanuel Tove, has more recently, like within the last 10 years, suggested that we should just start calling this, instead of 4Q rework Pentateuch. Your viewers will understand that means it came from K4.
Hmm.
All the copies came from K4. We should just start talking about these manuscripts as 4Q Pentateuch, because it sure starts to feel like this is an arbitrary distinction that we're setting on these manuscripts, which looks so dramatically different from anything else that we have. That the initial assumption was that this is some sort of paraphrased version of the Pentateuch for some reason, when in actual fact, what we probably have is just an entire different version of this, collection, this text, that we just never even knew of
Right.
before this discovery. And one of the really, I'll just say this too, when it comes to something like the rework Pentateuch, one of the really interesting questions I think that needs a lot further exploration as we move forward is how much these particular manuscripts have to tell us about this question of origins, in terms of who were the first people and under what circumstances were these five books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, put together,
Right.
the early stages of that. From a manuscript perspective, we're in a position now that the earliest evidence of that actually comes from these texts, these so-called reworked Pentateuch texts, about which we knew nothing prior to 1947.
Right. And these so-called abbreviated texts, I mean, we know that texts don't typically go from longer to shorter. They tend to go from shorter to longer. And
Yeah,
so that tells us something about the priority. I agree with you. The sacred cow that is the Masoretic text, this
let's
just needs
kill
to
it,
be
man.
done with. We just need to be done with it. It's a
Let it
medieval
go.
construction and it's artificial
Yeah.
in some ways. The
Yes.
Masoretes struggled with the text, even to this day. That when you go to read a Sefer Torah in a synagogue, you still don't read it the way that sometimes, in some cases, the way that it's pointed in the text, because like, and so this just shows you that even that text internally, and I think my favorite example of this is there's a psalm that we read, and it's an acrostic and it skips the nun,
The Dune
right?
verse.
The
Yeah.
nun verse, and the rabbis have all kinds of they spin with their heels trying to why. Oh, it's the nun is from nifal and it means to fall, and we don't want to put that in there, so they left it out,
Mhm.
and then it's there in the Dead Sea Scroll version,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
restored in the NOAB. And that's just one example of where the Dead Sea Scrolls
Oh,
and the Septuagint, when we're thinking about the Bible, what again,
yeah.
we have to think about this. Um, we have to think about this as a text that is an archaeological dig, and
Oh,
we have to ask, when are you talking about the book of Exodus? When are you talking about
yeah.
the book of Isaiah? When are you talking about the canon? because it's Esther and Ecclesiastes in there, because that was still at some level being debated. The whole whether they render the hands impure debates that you see in the
Yeah,
Talmud.
yeah.
Um, you know, and by the way, that was still being debated by Martin Luther. Martin Luther wanted to get rid of the book of James and the book of Esther. He
It's
called
true. Yeah.
James an epistle of straw.
A straw, epistle
Yeah,
of straw,
yeah,
that's
and
right.
he wanted it
Uh,
cast out of the Bible. So even whatever the
yeah.
canon is, it's still being debated in 16th century at some level.
You know,
So
you brought it up, so I have to mention, maybe my, well, maybe not my favorite, but one that I really started to think about more recently because, I'm on the book that I'm currently working on. I was writing up my own translation of Jeremiah chapter 23 or 24. I'm gonna get it wrong now. It's his oracle against King Jehoiakim,
mhm,
which reading it again in Hebrew and thinking through, and just imagining, if this is something that he said. I continue to like to imagine that Jeremiah is saying all this stuff, right? I'm aware of the historical issues with that, but it's fun. So imagining, what the just the way that he is just calling out the king. It's pretty great, but there are all these places, like hundreds, thousands, maybe, probably, places within the Masoretic text where they've repointed feminine pronouns, independent pronouns, suffix pronouns as masculine.
mm,
And for the longest time, you can look at that and go, well, yeah, sure, they're correcting an error. They probably are in a bunch of these instances, but how often are they eliminating something that's inherent within this text, in this oracle that Jeremiah delivers to King Jehoiakim? At one point, he's very sarcastically calling him out, and says, "My lord, his majesty," but he's point the consonantal text actually says, her majesty, to which the mastery says, "Oh, well, this is no good. We've got to put the whole involve on there to make sure everybody is aware
mm,
that this is." But what is he doing there? Is he? I mean, Jeremiah is not in any way above casting aspersions on his opponents by
no,
emasculating them and calling them women, right? So but this is like, it's just one of these I think it's a very interesting, a very cool feature of the text that gets lost,
right,
right?
yeah,
So,
these are issues that sound. I know, folks, these can sound nitpicky, but
mhm,
the there's two reasons why this is important. The first reason is if you're a religious person and you take the Bible seriously, well, you got to take it seriously. You can't take it half seriously as long as it lines up with your dogma. That's not actually you taking it seriously. That's you taking it seriously as far as it lines up with your dogma. And secondly, this is just a text that's had a huge impact on Western civilization. And having a deep
yes,
understanding of it, like, if you care about Shakespeare, if you care about, yeah, again, for this channel, things like magic, the Bible's crucially important in the development of Western magic.
yeah,
And so these these things that sound minor, I don't think they're minor at all. I think that they're recovering a text that we think we know, right? Voltaire famously said that the Bible is more celebrated than known, and I think that, and more derided than known too. And I think that
absolutely,
this is absolutely a place where we need
very
to
insightful, right? Yeah,
we leave it to Voltaire. Uh,
lots of people really hate Voltaire too,
yeah,
but
well, they always hate people that tell the truth.
it's true.
Inconvenient truths make you easy to hate. Um, what are some Dead Sea Scrolls, Kip, that we know the Great Isaiah Scroll, we know the War Scroll. This is sort of the
Mhm.
stuff that I think a lot of my audience will have had some, the Sectarian documents. What are some Dead Sea Scrolls that you think are really important that many people don't know a lot about? And you mentioned
Really important that
the
people.
Cave 4 paraphrases.
Yeah,
And those are
I think
really, I
those are
think you're
really
right. And those are
I think those are
interesting.
really important.
But what other texts do you
So
think are Dead Sea Scrolls that people should know more about just because they're revelatory in some sense or otherwise unusual?
sure. Well, I mean, again, there's a few different directions I can go here. Um, I think in terms of just thinking back to a lot of the work that I did in my own PhD, that I think so what I did in my PhD was an investigation of for lack of a better term, like traditions of Jeremiah as a figure, as a persona, and how that was translated and used as an authorizing feature in early Judaism. And one of the things that I think I wish people were more aware of is just how rich the landscape was in terms of the kinds of stories that these people seem to have wanted to tell about so many of their favorite people. You can read about this stuff like in the Genesis Apocryphon, for example, is a really,
Mhm,
really cool Aramaic text that is just ridiculously fun to read because it's fan fiction, in modern parlance, fan fiction. But I think, and I suspect that in their context, in the context in which this was written, yeah, there's definitely an element of that to it because people just love telling stories and hearing stories. But yeah, this is what we should take this just as seriously as a lot of the other manuscripts that we find there, just because we are still trying to figure out how to um make these decisions and,
mhm,
and judgments with regards to the function and usage of these manuscripts. But even beyond that, the Genesis Apocryphon are these tales of the patriarchs. They're filling in, the massive gaps that exist within the biblical stories. They're trying to answer uh perplexing questions about them and solve problems
mhm,
through this a brilliant text like this. But we have all sorts of stuff like this in the scrolls. There are 4 copies that I worked on of a text called the Apocryphon of Jeremiah, which is again features the prophet Jeremiah. He is in one. It's fragmentary, so we don't know everything what's there, but there's some tantalizing details of what's in it. In one scene, he's gathered with the exiles on the shores of the river Chabar in Babylon, and in another scene, he seems to be an earlier scene where he is with King Zedekiah and um, or should I say Zedekiah and Nebuchadnezzar, or sorry, Nebuzaradan was the captain of Nebuchadnezzar's forces who gouged out the eyes of the king, right, and killed all
right.
his sons
Killed his sons in
uh,
front
i-
of him and then gouged his
in
eyes. It was the
front of him, and
last
then
thing he
gouged
would
his eyes
see.
out.
Was the last thing he would
Exactly.
see. The Babylonians didn't play.
No, they didn't. They did not. So, but this, this is there. There's a whole not biblical retelling of this scene, and then you know there's there's all this additional apocalyptic material
Mhm,
where he seems to be delivering oracles, and there's an interesting quasi citation from the book of Nahum in there. So it's this collection of tantalizing connections that is happening with this prophet. But then there's other figures like Ezekiel has a whole collection of traditions associated with him. There's the fascinating treasure trove of Aramaic literature,
Hmm.
which we've barely tapped into
Right.
at this point, and they are, there's a number of common elements in there. They seem to really, really love telling stories about Levi, and his descendants, and they love telling stories about Daniel.
Right.
Uh, Maybe that's another thing too. One of the I hinted at it earlier. One of the really neat things that you see within the Dead Sea Scrolls is this development in real time, almost, of something like the Book of Daniel, which is written in the second century. Some of our earliest manuscripts go back pretty close
Hmm.
to the time at which this text was being written, but there's this wide range of other material there where it almost looks like there was all sorts of stories about Daniel
Right.
in
It's like a saga,
Aramaic.
right? It was
Some
The Daniel
Yeah,
sagas. Yeah.
yeah, there's lots
Yeah.
of stories that were being told about him, and a bunch of them seem to have just not made it. They didn't make the cut, right?
Right.
For this collection that survived. So, the Dead Sea
Right.
Scrolls is loaded with
Which is funny because in
other.
the Catholic Apocrypha, some of that literature does survive via Greek and
Yep,
stuff. So it's interesting that
yeah,
it sort of limped on in that way. And I think I agree with you. I very much agree with you that Aramaic literature gets really slept on. I
yeah,
think there's two things. There's the Aramaic literature that gets slept on, which is weird because Enoch is in Aramaic, and people
mhm,
love that for whatever reason.
mm,
And the second thing that strikes me as weird is that the weird prioritizing, where we'll prioritize Isaiah, and
yeah,
we'll prioritize the Isaiah as we have it, right? Like as we have it,
yep,
or as the Masoretes preserve it. And this, the Apocryphon of Genesis, whatever, that's
yeah,
pseudepigraphal, or that's whatever, that's fake. It's an apocryphon, right?
yeah,
It's not worthy. And for me, as a person who cares about the material conditions of the production of these scrolls, as a person who does calligraphy, the point I always make is the exact same amount of labor time and labor power and like allocation of communal resources that go into copying scrolls. It doesn't matter if you're copying Leviticus and like being so careful that you include the tetragrammaton written in Paleo Hebrew and all that, or you're writing something else. They both require the same labor time, which means that the community
and
prioritized the production of resources.
resources too, right?
Yep. Like
Like some of
the
these, like that's one
and
of one of the things that we have a tendency to do, and I think there's a lot more that my colleague and friend Matthew Munger, who also has a channel here on YouTube called uh, um, "The Bible Was Written Backwards,"
mm,
um, uh, which is a title that I am very disappointed I didn't come up with, but but he and I have been doing some of this work, and he gave a paper. I believe it's being published here in the near future. He gave a paper 2 SBLs ago where he just tracked um the the size of individual manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of the surprising
mhm,
results from just this question, because you have massive scrolls like some of these massive scrolls are like copies of Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Isaiah, but then some of the other massive scrolls are copies of the Chodayot, or the Genesis Apocryphon, or the Temple Scroll, or Instruction, or like the list goes on and on. And then you've got tiny scrolls, some of which are Deuteronomy 32,
mhm,
or the Ten Commandments, or this selection of texts that we really seem to like from Jeremiah's Confessions, or
right.
things like this, right? So or like the Book of Psalms, uh like, don't even get me started on the dynamic wide
Sure, of course.
range of material, like physical material that we have about the book of Psalms, which, may be large manuscripts, which may be complete psalters, 150 psalms, probably not, but look pretty big. And then you've got, another big one from Cave 11, the largest of the surviving Psalms manuscripts we have, which I think should be more problematic to a lot of people than it is, because the order of the material is just completely different from anything that survives. It's not the entire 150 Psalm Psalter, and there's a bunch of other stuff in there too, like the apostrophe of Zion or the sayings of David. um Second Samuel chapter 23, or it's like there's all this additional Ben Sira
Right.
appears in this. It's just there's there's this panoply
Right.
of material that shows us how complicated this question is with regards to w- how we understand the shape and function of, well, forget the Bible, just individual
Just
texts
individual
in
text. Yeah, that's
early
right.
Judaism,
Right.
the textual landscape, and then what are you going to do with that question in terms of understanding the formation of something like the Bible or even Scripture? Scholars, by and large, have gotten away from calling text biblical text for
Sure.
this reason, and now prefer to talk about scriptural text, which I'm not sure is all that much more
Yeah, I don't think it's much
helpful.
better. Yeah, I mean, because what's
Yeah, but
authoritative? I mean, clearly Ben Sirach was extraordinarily.
e-
I mean, again, like if Judaism went extinct in the third century and we found the archaeological remains of what they were reading, we would there'd be no reason to think that Ben
e-
Sirach wasn't right for right front and center with everything else.
yeah,
So yeah,
absolutely. And sure enough, we've got manuscripts.
hmm yep.
So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
It's funny the Bible's written backwards. There was a joke among me and several friends of mine growing up. We're learning to read Hebrew, and we wanted to have a bumper sticker that said, if it ain't backwards, it ain't Bible."
brilliant. I love it.
But it would not have gone over too well in Mississippi. Uh,
No, I guess not.
yeah, not so well. Maybe let's zoom out a little bit and talk about this question about who deposited this literature, right? And I'm always curious. Is again, I have to I always try to be really clear. I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm a tourist. I try to be an educated tourist, but I'm not a Bible scholar. It's not my area of specialization. You know, again, I try to be clear about this, and I'm always curious about where the conversation is vis-a-vis the folks that
Yeah.
call themselves the Yachad, the folks that seem to have been living at Qumran, who probably have some relationship to these caves and the texts in them,
Mhm,
and then this group called the Essenes that we seem to know primarily from Josephus and Philo and
mhm.
Pliny and stuff like that. And one of the things that I think folks probably should know from Esoterica is that the word Essene or Essenim, depending on how you want to do that plural, never occurs, or we've never found it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And
Nope.
so I'm curious, Kip, where is the scholarship these days? Where's the consensus? What are folks thinking about? You know, about who's deposited these scrolls? What's the connection to Qumran? What's the connection to the Essenes? Where is that conversation
Yeah.
now in the scholarship?
So
And not, and
I
again,
mean, you may
consensus is
be
a strong word, but sort of where is that
yeah.
conversation?
Yeah. I mean, you may be reluctant to identify yourself as a biblical scholar, but you're certainly a scholar, so you understand how difficult it is for uh, scholars to try and provide satisfying answers without betraying so much of the nuance,
Sure,
right? That
of course.
that encounters these conversations. So so I think for the most part, what we call the Essene hypothesis, or what is more appropriate, what most of my colleagues would prefer to identify as the Groningen hypothesis, about the relationship of the texts that were found in the caves to the site, which is Qumran. The ruins of Qumran are right there on the western shore of the Dead Sea, literally a stone's throw away from a number of the caves.
Yeah.
Um, eh, there's this relationship there that scholars remain comfortable with, and this identification of the Essenes from Philo and Josephus and Pliny, mostly by virtue of the fact that they identify this location or somewhere close to it, right, with this group. And then Josephus's, in particular, his description of them and his understanding of their ideology and their worldview and their flavor of Judaism seems to align with a lot of what we see in what scholars would identify as the constitutional texts or the rule text, the texts which seem like that came out of this community. But let's be clear here again, even that is just us as scholars looking at this material and saying, "Oh, well, there's a bunch of these texts which seem to have a lot of common features among them.
Hmm.
This must be the ones that they wrote, right?" Like, there's so much that we just don't know. But I would say I think the prevailing view, and let's be honest, it's we do a lot of things as scholars for the sake of convenience. Just because if we didn't, it's hard to get anything done, right?
Sure. Same
So
with
yeah,
Gnosticism, right? Like
exactly.
since
It's a
Michael
convenient
Williams, we
label.
know that this term is problematic and
Yeah, yeah.
complicated, but yet, what are we going to do, right?
Sure. So this
Right.
group, if we're right that there is such a thing as so-called sectarian texts, that is a collection within the collection of texts that this particular group seems to have written, this group that identifies themselves as the Yachad, which just means the community or the
Right.
congregation. Um, if that is true, then uh, then yes, it seems that this was a group that aligns best with the Essenes as described by some of these other writers. Now, I think we can raise some important questions as well about how much Josephus really actually knew
No, he
about the
interpret
Essenes,
he projects on them these other Stoic philosophers and stuff.
oh
He's
yes,
clearly doing his Josephus thing where he's selling this to the Romans, right? So he's like, "Oh yeah, they're
yes.
Stoics."
Oh, they're just like that.
Yeah,
So, how would he know? Especially since if he's also right that they're sort of a secret organization who aren't all that particularly interested in talking to you about about their arcane rituals and practices. So, but that's like a whole other thing, right?
right.
This is a connection that scholars continue to take seriously. Yeah, it seems like there's something there. It seems like this, for lack of a better term, probably represents the library of the Essenes or a library of the Essenes. But there are really important, more recent pushbacks against this. There's been some work by both Alison Schofield and John Collins, the great John Collins, pushing a little bit back against this designation and against our understanding of who the Essenes were.
Right.
One of the things that I think, and Larry Schiffman's been really good on this too. One of the things that I think people need to pay more attention to is just how closely the writers and the collectors of these manuscripts seem to have been to the temple
Right.
and to the Jerusalem priesthood in a variety of ways. They're clearly a disenfranchised group, but they know uh and the their conversations about ritual and the temple and the priesthood are pretty intimate and internal. Like they know the ins and outs
Right.
of everything that's going on there. That's something that we should really take seriously. I think it should affect in some ways our perspective. I gotta just clear my throat here for a second. Sorry. um, it should affect, I think, in some important ways, our perspective of who these people were socially. Writing and collecting these Dead Sea Scrolls, we can fall into the temptation because they were for again, a lack of a better term, seem to have been something of an ascetic group. They're living out in the wilderness, or at least they've got this center out in the wilderness where they're writing, collecting literature, selling pottery, waiting for the end of the world. All these things, right? There's the temptation to think that these were simple people in some respects. If you're just living simply out in the wilderness, when in actual fact, they're probably really wealthy. They're probably from these upper echelon so-called elite sectors of society. They came from the families of power in in Jerusalem and in Judaism. So, and we can see that because they've got like means to, write,
Mhm.
produce, collect piles of manuscripts. And yeah, it so I there's been there's close connections they have to the temple establishment in many respects. And
And I
I'll
think
say
that's
one more thing
also
about.
a relationship that I've also thought of as being transitive, is that this also
Yeah.
should make us think about the fact that the Jerusalem priesthood is not a monolith.
Yes,
We tend to
right.
think of them as, like, all believing one thing. They're all Sadducees or something.
Yeah,
Whatever
yeah.
whatever group you wanna pull out of a hat from the
You
Bible
had
or whatever.
the video
Uh,
you did last week about the temple, the copper scroll touches on this, right?
mhm.
Because this is a question that I continue to have about what are you going to do with the copper scroll, which seems like it could be, it could have come out of the Jerusalem temple itself. Um, but like I know like Puesh has made a pretty good case for why it didn't and why it should be connected to the Qumran community. Not sure I agree entirely with him, but yeah, yeah, that's a thing that it's it's very probable. But on this same question, he makes the point too that you know there were Essenes all over the place. If
Right, Josephus says
these
there were
are Essenes,
4,000 of them. Yeah.
yeah, right.
Yep.
There were Essenes in Jerusalem.
Mhm.
There were Essenes in the temple, probably,
Sure.
right. So
And
it's
even because even if you disagreed with the temple leadership, the temple leadership was constantly changing. People were buying their way into the high priesthood. No
yeah,
one liked how that thing was being run. And so the
no,
fact that you would have dissidents in, so this is why people like, or sometimes people think, well, how could the Christians after Jesus continued to go to the temple? I'm like, there were all kinds of people with all kinds of flavors of Judaism, none of which like the high priests and the people running the show. I mean, ask Jews how many people love their the president of the synagogue. Like we go to institutions all the time in which we don't like the leadership, and yet we would never say, "I'm done. I'm out."
yeah,
And I
yeah,
think the Essenes, and again, we listen to, and also if you look at the graveyard, I think is what's revelatory
right,
too.
yes,
The
yeah.
graveyard versus the population that site could have maintained versus the amount of scroll, like, you're looking at, the numbers are really weird when you start trying to do
Oh,
the
they are.
material analysis of what's going on here exactly. Like, and also there's some women buried in the graveyard, which is
Yeah.
interesting. Not many, but a few.
Hmm.
But eh,
Well,
you know, and what is this
it's one
site?
of
Is it
the.
a scriptorium? Is
Oh,
it a retreat center? Is it,
exactly.
and again, if Josephus is to be trusted, that the Essenes are spread out through the population, which seems much more likely to me than
Yeah.
they're all crowded together at Qumran. That site can't hold but a few hundred people.
Right.
that this is a mobile population, and
Mhm.
that makes a lot more sense, and they're intersecting with other Judaisms again,
Yeah.
and I think this is an important thing, right? Like, there isn't Judaism yet. There rabbinical Judaism is still several hundred years out, um, and what's happening here is there are Judaisms of which
Yeah.
the Essenes were maybe a quite, eccentric in their orbit, but still recognizably Jewish by any stretch of the
Could
imagination.
be.
In fact, I would say the Sadducees are probably more unusual to us if we think about Judaism as it exists now, and they're much more closer to Israelite religion, right?
Right?
Like,
Yes.
yeah, like
Yes,
they're no
exactly.
afterlife, no angels and demons. Like, I
Yep.
would like they're much closer to Israelite
Yep.
religion than they are to rabbinical Judaism, and yet I think they're far
And
more.
without the temple, we have nothing.
Right,
It's just like that's it, right? It's
yeah,
all there.
yep,
Uh, but it's an important point that you make, and stressing the fact that this is very much transitory, that there's lots of intersections throughout the region with all sorts of different groups, should also affect the ways in which we think about the literature there. Like in terms of I've been kind of partial in the past to thinking about the place as a retreat center, as a place where you come and you spend some time. It seems I like how it sort of neatly fills this mandate to go into the wilderness and to prepare the way of Yahweh, to prepare the way of God, and to make straight his paths. You know, there seems to be a strong ritual component within the people who wrote and collected
mm,
this literature, which makes me think that this is something that they imagined they had to do, even if temporarily, right? So I
or even like
like
a
that
hospice.
idea.
I think I've
Yeah,
also thought maybe as a hospice too, that
sure.
this is where people are going at the very end and maintaining an
Yeah,
extremely
right.
high level of ritual purity, and that's why the graveyard's there.
Just
I mean,
yeah,
that,
exactly. No, that's a
um
that's a very good point. But it should also affect the ways in which we think about, because one of the things, and it bugs me to no end. One of the things that really bugs me about the ways in which some scholars and apologists and popularizers have tended to treat the literature from Qumran is as if it's all just arcane, that this is just this really weird, isolated uh segment of Judaism, so we don't have to actually take
right,
anything there seriously, because it's so fringe and out there and completely different from what everybody else was doing. No, like for one thing, this is all we've got from the period. And for another thing, because of the kind of circulation and traffic that is likely taking place, there's manuscripts and there's texts and there's um, there's stuff coming in from all over the place.
right.
There's no reason why we should uh, like wall off this group and treat them like they're special. And I think that's one of the ongoing questions here. I think, yeah, it's important for us to continue to gain a clearer understanding of who this group was and what they were doing. Yeah, probably scenes, for lack of a better term, but how much does this actually represent Judaisms, as we're growing to understand
Right.
from the Second Temple period.
And right, and even the manuscript holdings as material evidence point to the fact that there are several hundred years of manuscript
Yes.
production, and
Yes.
if this group is so out there and so celibate and so walled off, they wouldn't survive that long. I mean, four
I
thousand
think so.
people is a lot of people, and so again, using Josephus's numbers, which I'm sure are inflated to some degree, but Yeah, I don't buy that either. I also tend to agree that this is an important site, but not their only site. Um, I guess just a couple of things we can maybe jump on before we wrap up, assuming you have time. Um,
I Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful.
And
Is
I could go all day
Oh, me too. I
with
you know,
people,
they could
right?
chew the rag about that. It's
Yeah.
this community, and also I think people also just don't realize how inhospitable that climate is. I mean, I've been out there
Yeah.
in May, and it's already 40
I
Celsius,
I have
and
not been out there in May,
it is
so
I mean, people talk about, oh, it's just a short walk. I'm like, a short walk in 40-degree Celsius weather is like that'll kill you to walk out to out to Cave 11 and to, oh, it's just 2 kilometers away. I'm like,
boy.
2 kilometers away in that weather is lethal. Um,
Mhm.
so, I mean, who knows how different the climate was back then, but I don't think that it was fundamentally.
It's probably no, it seems it would be surprising to me if it was that different,
Yeah,
right?
I think but yeah, I think
Oh,
that there is sort of a purification kind of out in the wilderness
mhm.
thing. Um, I guess another question I want to talk about is the Pesher literature. This is a
Oh,
literature that I think
yeah,
gets totally slept on, and I think
I agree.
that when you look at the Habakkuk Pesher and the other Pesher literature, and for folks who don't know, Pesher just means commentary, right, or something like
Mhm.
commentary. It's not quite riffing is maybe. I think it's sort of
Yeah,
it's like a Second Temple period Judaism jazz. Um,
yeah.
and I think this literature is just so important because when you see the rise of early Christianity, the Jesus movement, when they're doing basically writing peshers, right?
Yes.
Sometimes I think of the Gospels as the Isaiah pesher. Now they talk about
Yeah.
Isaiah as the fifth gospel, and I'm like, no, no, no. The Gospels are just the Isaiah pesher. Like
They even use the same technical
the
term in a
same.
lot of places,
Yep.
right?
And I think this is a place where for people who are interested in the relationship of early Christianity and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Pesher literature, in my opinion, and again, this is just what I think, is that that's our greatest window into the thought patterns and the hermeneutical patterns of how people were reading text to understand the reality in front of them. And so I don't know,
Yeah.
maybe you can talk a little about the Pesher
Oh,
literature and
so
sort of why, if you would agree with me that this literature is more important than people realize, especially thinking about sort of this early period of that produces the Jesus movement and rabbinical Judaism
yeah.
and etc.
Yeah, on several levels. I think it's more interesting and more important than it's given credit for. Like so for in the first place, the so-called Pesherim are always categorized or identified as so-called non-biblical texts, right?
Mhm.
Because they're not copies of the Bible, but there's very important text critical questions to raise with regards to these texts because they are citing they are citing whole chunks
Mhm.
of what we identify as the Bible. And there are scholars who have been doing that kind of work, but it's the kind of work that also does not show up readily in your copy of BHQ. So but yeah, I think that's important. Now one like it's it's sort of a frustrating classification as
Sure.
well, just because we use this way of identifying a particular selection of text from within this larger collection, predominantly on the basis of the usage of the word pashar. Uh, um, because it shows up all the time, uh, and it's used formulaically very frequently in a lot of these texts. But at the by the same token, so many of these things, right? They exist on a spectrum where you've got like these ones over here, like the Nahum Pesher and the Habakkuk Pesher, and the Micah Pesher, the Isaiah Pesherim, the Psalms Pesherim. These sorts of things look like they're all fitting into the same sort of group of texts. It's a running commentary. They're citing a selection of, a text that they're reading, a scripture, right? And they're providing some discussion about it. And it's all in the same sort of vein one of the really intriguing things, and I'll talk about this in a minute because this is something that I'm keenly interested in. One of the things that is of great importance to the writers of this literature is how these scriptures are speaking to them within their own time
Right.
and their own experiences, right? So, and that's really important.
Mhm.
But just in terms of format and structure and language, these seem to be a group of texts. But then you've got other ones, right? Where things like um, the so-called Melchizedek scroll
Right.
from Cave 11 has been
Fascinating document.
identified. Oh, yeah,
Such a
right.
weird document. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like there's not much
Right.
there,
Yeah.
not much left, but there have been, entire books,
Yep.
hundreds of articles written about just this manuscript because of it's so interesting and different. But it's been classified as a pesher by some. Then you got things like the one of the manuscripts that my doctor father George Brooke did a lot of his work, his PhD work on, the 4Q 252, the so-called commentary on Genesis, is a type of a pesher. But the way he discusses it, right? He talks about its placement within the history of hermeneutics, where this is something that was written at an early stage when this formulaic way in which we're going to treat these texts is still developing. So it's kind of an interesting transitional species between this grouping of texts which are so-called interpretations of scripture, which are just total paraphrases. You're just basically rewriting entire biblical texts. It's making its way from there to this more structured way of presenting your source text and then providing comment on it. This is an interesting manuscript that is still straddling both of those worlds. It's an interesting approach from an historical question, but I like to one of the things that I like to do with the Pesher Room, and one of the things that really interests me is um, what they thought they were doing
Right.
now when they're writing these texts. But importantly, it raises questions of, well, what do they think scriptures even are? Like these texts. If I'm reading the book of Habakkuk and now I'm going to write about what's going on in my community and things that have happened to my leader, the teacher of righteousness, and how he was treated by the Jerusalem temple establishment. If I'm telling my own story, isn't it interesting that I have to retell it in the structure and the framework of this ancient text? So, like, the Pesherim are straight up uh, fulfillments of prophecy
Mhm.
from the perspective of the writer, which I think that's extremely interesting. But the other thing I like to see when I'm reading the Pesherim is how much these texts have to say about just the conceptions of writing history
Right.
within early Judaism, right? Like these aren't these aren't histories in the Hellenistic view of what that is. Like that's a whole genre of literature that we've now, inherited. Um, but in no in no in a way, and in an even how do I put this? I think in an analogous way, this is a way in which people from this time period, from this particular culture, understood that this is how you do history in many respects too. And I always like to do, I don't know how often you encounter them in your work, but I have a tendency to run afoul the Jesus mythicists on a regular basis. And this is a way that I've come to approach this question by saying, look, we have these manuscripts, we have these texts from Qumran, the Pesherim. They tell us all about this figure that we don't even know his name.
Right.
They just talk about this figure called the teacher of
Teacher of
righteousness.
righteousness. Yeah.
No idea who this
Right.
was, uh, beyond just this. There's no mention of him or identification of him,
Mm.
as far as we know, in any other sources. Now, I know scholars and enthusiasts have attempted to identify, uh,
Zadok priest of various. Yeah. Yeah. It's a
yeah, yeah.
huge line of
So
possibilities, but yeah.
many possibilities, but we just don't know,
Right.
right? And there's not nearly enough connective tissue there to be sure of, even remotely sure of anything. So, what are we going to? But if this is all we have, and importantly, the only way these texts appear to know about the teacher of righteousness is because they're reading the book of Habakkuk or they're reading the book of Nahum, and they're going, "Oh, wow, this is what the book of Habakkuk has to say, and this is all about the teacher of righteousness, and this is all about what happened to him." So I don't know. Are you going to tell me now that the teacher of righteousness must have been a mythical figure who didn't exist just because you know he's couched in this esoteric prophetic language, and they only seem to be learning about him or knowing about him? You and I know differently, but from just a straight cold perspective of these manuscripts, they seem to only know about him because they're reading about him in texts that were written hundreds of years prior. I think there's some really fascinating questions that intersect as well with the gospel literatures that have to do with just the ways people were conceptualizing
Right.
history and doing historiography that that are that we draw from this fascinating collection of literature.
I completely agree. And also just the idea of authority in scripture, the idea that you could
Yeah, right.
interpolate you that not only could you interpolate yourself into it, but you had to.
Yeah,
Like that
right.
the
Exactly.
and that the idea that like, you know, like we have totally different understandings of like of these scriptures in some sense. And the idea that these people felt entitled's not the right way, but that they were interacting with them as interpolating themselves and their condition into them. And this is the reason why I think that this because you don't see many biblical texts doing that, right? Where like how many times
No.
outside of maybe the building of the Mishkan in Exodus does the biblical text as we know them refer back to the creation story, the Adam and Eve story?
Right. Yeah.
They don't really care about it. We're obsessed
No.
with it.
Yeah.
But they don't seem to care about it at all. They never were like, well, if you read back in the book of blah 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 and Bereshit, it says this, and we can derive this lesson. There's no intertext. There's not so much intertextuality, but in there's an explosion of intertextuality as witnessed by the Pesher literature, as witnessed by the Gospels, as witnessed by other kinds of text at that time.
Yep.
Um, and I just think that
Yeah.
this is a
No.
place where the Pesher literature is so important, but it's so weird that, again, for whatever reason, and I think it has to do with what you said, right? It has to do with this fact that it's not biblical. And because it's not
Yeah.
biblical and it's not exotic, and in the way that some of the so-called sectarian documents are exotic, it doesn't get the play that it deserves, in my
But yeah,
opinion.
so and there's like there's one place in the community rule, the Sarach Hayachad,
Mhm.
which speaks of the importance of there being someone present to read aloud
Right,
the law 24 hours a day. But in addition, there's also someone there to provide interpretation,
right,
right? So are they reading aloud text like the Pesherim?
right.
Um, so, which could fit that description, right? On the but just one more thing on this historical connection and what you said about how necessary it was for them to insert themselves into their scriptures. I think in the series that I made about the Dead Sea Scrolls, when I do a video on the Pesherim. I think at one point the way I put it there was that it's almost like um it made seeing yourself in these texts is what made it almost hyper real.
Hmm.
Like it raised it to another level of significance. So we can imagine and not just the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean the people who the were behind the gospels are doing the same thing, and you see it in Philo. He's doing the same thing, right? Where you are so immersed in this literature to the point where you just start your natural inclination is to start seeing connections all over the place
Right.
in places. And that's the other interesting element here with regards to the Pesherim. We do see it in other places too, but it's really like it's really pronounced in the Pesherim just how much this literature is being radically transformed in
Right.
this period to mean things
Right.
that it didn't used to. And it almost seems like there are no guardrails on how far you want to push this word or this phrase or these concepts in terms of how they're going to in terms of the types of meanings that they're going to draw from
Right.
them.
Well, it's
It's
it's.
wild.
I mean, it's the eschatological suspension of whatever bumpers or something. Like the
Yeah.
world's about to end, and you're seeing it everywhere. Like
Yeah.
I think I think that for many people for whose apocalyptic eschatological kind of thing is. I mean, again, I grew up around people in the American South for whom they were seeing signs everywhere.
Yeah.
And then it was right there in the book of Revelation, or it was there in the book of Daniel, or whatever. Whatever Saddam Hussein did, he was the Antichrist, or whoever's the Antichrist today. Um, that, and again, I
Still
think that
doing it.
for anyone
People are
interested
still
in
doing it.
that kind of logic, I mean, the between reading some of the Pesherim, like Habakkuk, and the reading the War Scrolls, imagine that circuit, and you're out in the
Yeah.
desert, and that circuit is the circuit you're living in. I mean, you I mean, you can imagine someone like that being convinced that
Yeah.
when you
You
see
know,
in some of the text of Paul, like some of you will not taste death. People, oh, he's being metaphorical. I'm like, he wasn't being
oh
metaphorical.
no.
Like
Yeah, and one of the things, the gospel writers get a really hard time all the time about how bad, how much they got the Bible wrong, right?
Mhm.
A virgin will conceive and give birth, is just a straight up misreading of Isaiah, chapter 7,
7:14, I
6, 7.
think.
Yeah, yeah, 7:14. Um, right, like that's common in some of the online communities that I am involved in. That's a common thing. But what I often tell people, and I say it over and over again, no, no, no. Listen, they're just doing good Second Temple
Hmm.
Jewish scripture exegesis, and this is what was done. Stretch the text, probe the text to such a level, such a microscopic level that you're going to find these deep hidden meanings in there
Right.
that just have nothing to do with poor Isaiah and what he was really
No,
saying
of course, because what he was
to
really
the
saying and what the
Pharisees.
historical circumstances wasn't what it mattered. What mattered was the imminent.
No, it's now.
Yeah, right. And then again, you
It's
see this in the
talking to us
Mishnah, right?
now.
In
Yeah,
the Mishnah, hafak baba hafak baba, like turn it,
yeah,
turn it.
yeah.
Like anything can be found. And
Yep.
that's not just a description. It's an imperative.
Yeah.
Go do it. Like, this is rabbinical hermeneutics. And sure, and again, this is the thing I tell people, like, and again, think about the Dead Sea Scroll literature with the War Scrolls. If you were to hand me any book of the New Testament and I were a first century, second century Jew, the the Apocalypse of John would be the most immediately recognizable Jewish text in that whole collection to me. And
Yeah, for
I'm like,
sure.
"Oh, sure, yeah, 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 I
Yeah.
know, my buddy Yohanan, he also wrote one of these." Um, yeah, they got one over there. They got trumpets and, banners they're making to make sure that when the end comes, they can blow the right trumpets at the
Yeah.
right time.
This
Yeah,
is another text which seems to again just seems to defy description and categories because it's a yeah it's clearly an apocalyptic text, um for whatever that's worth, but there is it's a ritual
yeah,
text.
it's liturgical. The
It's
repetitions are clearly
liturgical,
liturgical, yeah.
and we say, I mean, there's connections. There are these when and I'm happy you mentioned the fact that there's war scrolls. Like
Mhm,
we have the large copy. It was the first of these to be discovered. It was one of the first manuscripts to be discovered. The copy from Cave One, and it's also the latest copy
right,
as far as I'm aware. I believe it's the latest one that we have. We found fragments from Cave 4 of so they had more, right? They had a few. And they range a little bit in terms of how we date them over probably 80 years, I want to say. But there's a lot of really interesting things that you encounter when you start looking at these Cave 4 copies and comparing them to this the large one that survives from Cave 1. Um, Mais Baye is the scholar who published the K4 manuscripts in the 1980s, and what he did when he published them is he organized all the material based on, and it's a sensible thing to do. He just organized all the material based on how it appears in this large copy that we have from Cave 1,
right,
right? But then he encountered some issues because some of the copies, one of the copies in particular, it's called 4QMA, 4Q Mahama A, 4Q491. Um, it has stuff in it that doesn't appear
right.
in the Cave 1 copy. But then, and one of the things that appears in this particular manuscript of the War Scroll is something called that's been called the self glorification hymn. It's this amazing piece of poetry in which the speaker talks about basically living in the divine assembly amongst the gods, and then being poorly treated. But all it's pretty wild. It's made a lot of people really excited about how how much you can draw intersections between some of the self-conception of the speaker in a manuscript like this, and a messianic figure like Jesus.
Mhm,
I think people get carried away in that direction, and fail to understand what I think is really going on here, which is the ways in which people in this time period are still imagining the cosmic realm and the relationship to it, and how much more open it is than it is for us in the modern world. But one of the wild things about it is we have other copies of this hymn,
mm,
the so-called self-glorification hymn, but not in other copies of the War Scroll. They're in copies of the Horayot, this
right, which makes sense.
collection of
Yeah,
hymns.
that's
It does,
yeah,
from a genre perspective, it makes sense, right? But then, yeah, what is it doing in here? And the other interesting thing, and I've some of my work, my academic work, has been in this direction in terms of looking at these fragments of this particular manuscript of the War Scroll and trying to figure out how they fit together. Um, Bae made the mistake of just following, the outline of this large manuscript on QM. When you actually take a look at the fact that this is 4Q 4QMA is a manuscript that was actually copied by two different scribes. And when you put the pieces together in a sensible way, which reveals what two different scribes are doing, all of a sudden the entire arrangement of the manuscript is it's thrown entirely on its head. Then you've got this self glorification in there, which seems to occur at the same point in the manuscript, which is why for a long time scholars had identified the self glorification hymn with the angel Michael,
Right.
because in the Cave One copy, there's this scene in which Michael basically comes in and fights
Right. In the
on
night.
behalf of the Sons of Light
Right.
and victory. Uh, but I think what we're dealing with here is also a question of historical development. Like you have this earlier manuscript which seems to be putting these some pieces of a couple different things together. Has are they fragmentary bits at this point that then ends up getting reconstructed into more of a narrative presentation of a ritual, right?
Mhm.
And developments of things that are taking place within this one manuscript too. It just there's so many questions.
Right. And this is also gets to putting, to point your point earlier about the development of Daniel, right? Because this is also where we see this whole business about
Yep.
angels fighting on behalf of nations,
Oh yeah.
and so like this, how does that talk to the War Scroll and the War Scrolls rather, and this hymn?
I mean,
So yeah.
they're living with them. I think this is one of the things that I think is so cool that people just don't miss from the outside when they don't look at it closely. Like, well, they one of the reasons for the strict purity of this group, which is explicitly communicated in the War Scroll, is because they imagined that they were going to be drafted into
Hmm.
the war between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness, which meant that they were going to be encamped on the battlefield and might be pitching a tent next to an angel
Right.
who's going to be fighting alongside you, right? So yeah, you have to make sure that that camp is like ultra pure, because you're in the presence of divine beings 24 hours a day. It's just it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a world that I think most of us, again, it's a world that's so foreign,
Yeah,
and like the eschatological buildup, and and again, I know we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but there's some of those sequences in Josephus where he describes the Essenes going to war, and he describes the two battles basically, and they get slaughtered. I mean, it's
yeah.
massacred. He like the
It's
and I always
it's a
worry.
terrible war strategy.
Yeah, yeah, it's a terrible, and this is what I always worry is that they marched out there, tahor tahor,
Yeah,
and in their white robes, and then with their banners and with their horns, and you read the narrative, right? They get slaughtered through the day, and then at night Michael comes, and he, the angel of the Lord
yeah,
comes and strikes the Kittim down, and I think that they would have, that day they would have just been massacred, and like it's
yeah.
all going according to plan, and then the massacre just kept going, and
Oh
I was like,
no,
hold on,
nothing's happening.
yeah, like where is Michael?
Where's
And
my
there's just something about that sequence.
Mm,
Again, if it played out the way that I can imagine it having played out,
mm.
I mean, what a horrifying, if that were a scene
Yeah,
in a
really.
film, right? Where
Oh,
the last 10, or the last
people be
few of them,
crying. They really would. People would
it
be bawling,
it would deter. I
watching
mean,
this.
yeah.
'Cause yeah,
Um,
it's true.
just yeah, again, I think I said this a lot on the channel, but if your strategy is the Lord will save us, go home. Um,
Stay home.
go home. Well, I guess the last two things to talk about are just the sort of the prehistory of the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the things that really fascinates me is that we tell a
Mm,
story about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls as if they were found in the 40s, and you know and one of the things that fascinates me is the fact that we get these narratives through time, where these a scrolls found in Engedi, a scrolls found in Jericho. Origin may have had one, and he used it to build out his version of whatever. And what's
yeah,
even interesting to me is that what did the Masoretes have? Did they have some of these scrolls? When they were building their text, which really gives a whole another dimension to the Masoretic priority. Um,
Sure it does. Yeah.
and so, just any sort of thoughts or reflections on the fact that, you know, in some ways, again, I think people often don't really understand how big Israel Palestine is, or rather how small it is. It's a country the size of New Jersey, all told,
Mhm.
which it's a tiny. I think you can fit. I think one time I said you can fit like three Israel Palestines into Mississippi or something, right? It's a tiny area, and it's an
Yeah.
inhospitable walk from Jerusalem to Jericho, but it is one could one. It's not
You
far.
can you can do it.
You could
Yeah.
do it. It wouldn't like you to do it,
No.
but, it's pretty nasty out there
And
in the
it
Judean
and
wilderness.
then, how long would it take you to get home? Because it's all uphill then
Yeah, it's
too,
all
right?
uphill in the heat.
In the heat.
Yeah, chas
So,
v'chalila. But,
uh
where's scholarship now on sort of the prehistory of the scrolls? Is this sort of is this a thing that people acknowledge? 'Cause I tell you what I've never seen, I would love to see, is just a anthology of
yeah,
all of the texts that mention someone having a book that they found because there's a Karaite scholar that comes in Jerusalem in the 10th century with one. I would just love to see an anthology of,
yeah,
Davila's putting out this collection of Old Testament uh, pseudepigrapha that just came out. So volume 2 just landed at my house actually,
right.
and he did a great thing where he collected all of the books all the books referenced inside of the Hebrew Bible that don't survive otherwise, like the
Right,
Sefer
yes.
Milchemot Hashem or whatever.
That's right.
Um, and I would love to see an anthology of all these references to the potential Dead Sea Scrolls found before,
Uh,
but also anecdotes about Dead Sea Scrolls that seem to have been discovered since the discovery and aren't anywhere to be found. We
oh,
so
wow.
that
I mean, that's a book project,
Yeah, isn't that
honestly.
wouldn't it be neat to
Maybe you
like
should write that, dude.
sh
It
like, I love the
so
prehistory, but also the
oh, yeah.
post-history. Like,
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
all these things floating around, and,
Well,
there's these, and again, you just had on a scholar, talking about forgeries of them, so they're even living on in sort of a weird way, being written on shoes from Hadrian's Wall and stuff.
see, now this is venturing right into my shop.
Yeah,
I'll say my Dr. Father George Brooke wrote a coffee table book once, and it was published. I want to say like 2005, 2006. So like before any of the more modern craziness with private collectors
right.
happened. But I love the way that he began his coffee table book. He began by telling the story of um, Moses Shapiro and his his manuscripts
God
that
knows what it
were
was.
published. Who knows what it was? We'll
Yeah,
never know.
we'll never know.
The valedictory of Moses, as Idan Dershowitz, as I started calling it. Um, but the reason he tells this story in the introduction to a book about the Dead Sea Scrolls is because one of the primary reasons Shapira was dismissed as a fraud, importantly, not the only reason, but one of the reasons he was right away dismissed as a fraud and that these manuscripts were discarded as forgeries is because scholars who looked at them said, there's no way anything could have survived out there this long
Right.
and looked like this. And that was like what, 1880?
Yep.
I think 1880s.
Sounds like that. Yeah.
60, 70 years later, you know, lo and behold, there are caves full of this stuff, hundreds of manuscripts, many of which are in remarkably better condition than, as these things that Shapira had, uh, as they're described, right? Like it raises, and to be clear, I just need to say, you're right. We don't know. We'll never know because the things are lost somewhere in the basement of the British Library. But I'm not remotely convinced that Shapiro's scrolls were authentic. I think they probably were forgeries, but I think it's a tantalizing question, and
Right.
it is
To
really
solve it.
interesting to think through how much is out there, how much is no longer out there that once was out there. More recently, I think like 10 years ago, a little more. Uh, the news broke of the discovery of so-called Cave 12, which doesn't have any manuscripts in it, but looks like it did, right? At one point in time. This is why it's been linked to the site of Qumran. This is why it's been identified as Cave 12Q, because there's shards of pottery which match, the kind of pottery they had there, and there's textiles. These textiles that they use to wrap manuscripts have been found in there. So, yeah, I guess, or maybe this was Origin's cave. Like, maybe that was it, right? Like, we just don't know, and it's
Right.
it's very cool. I love this book project idea, by the way. I really do, of investigating these narratives. But I like the fact too, that how much they continue in the modern world. Like, you and I talked off camera a
Hmm.
little bit about things that one of the editors, the former chief editor of the Dead Sea Scrolls, John Strugnell, uh, told stories of seeing complete copies of
Book
like the
of
Book of
Enoch.
Enoch,
Yeah,
right?
Aramaic Book of Enoch. I
in,
mean,
in
it's crazy.
Aramaic.
Yeah, in
Yeah,
Kuwait or something. Like
right.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
He talks about there's talk of like this angel scroll
Hmm.
that nobody's ever seen, but we keep hearing about. And then there's things like yeah, I mentioned to you before we started recording. I particularly love this story that John, sorry, um, Frank Cross, one of the editors, tells of going to Beirut to meet Iskander Shahin Kando, the antiquities dealer who basically brokered all the sales of the Dead Sea Scrolls between the Ta'amir Bedouin and the archaeologists at the École Biblique. So
And
it
folks should
just
know, right? This was advertised in the New York Times. Scrolls for sale.
right. Yes. Yes. And Kando too. So at this time, this is setting the historical context here, right? Like it's just on the like weeks before the breakout of the Six-Day War in the spring of 1967. Uh, so Kando's like actively looking at this point for someone to buy uh his his holy grail, which is the Temple Scroll. And he's been holding on to it at this point for over 10 years. He's been holding on to this manuscript because he understands at this point how valuable it
Hmm.
is, and he's going to make his fortune on this manuscript. So but things are getting really tense and scary, and so he escalates in his efforts to find someone to buy it. So he's putting feelers out there. Scholars are hearing about this too. One of the people who is currently he's talking to, but he doesn't know he's talking to, is actually Yagal Yadin,
Mm.
through an intermediary, trying to broker a deal for the purchase of the Temple Scroll. Kando doesn't know that, but Frank hears about it. He gets in contact with a wealthy benefactor, Elizabeth Bechtel, who's a steel magnate in Pittsburgh. She gives him, she pledges $1 million for him to go and purchase this scroll. So he connects with Kando and says, "I've got a buyer. Let's close this deal." Kando says, "Meet me in Beirut." So so Cross flies out to Beirut, arrives in late at night, and he he checks into his hotel. He ends up meeting with a contact who's not Kando, but sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It's all very cloak and
Oh
dagger.
yeah,
This
this would
whole
all
story,
make
right?
great a great movie. I mean,
It totally
yeah,
would, and he's told, "Mr. Kando will meet you under a bridge the next night at, like, midnight," right? Come alone sort of thing. So Frank shows up under the bridge, and Kando arrives in his own car. He says in this he writes this all, helpfully has written this whole account out for us in a letter, to Elizabeth Bechtel, but instead of he's expecting, to buy the temple scroll or at least to see the temple scroll. But Kando shows up with a box full of smaller fragments of things that, as Cross is writing about it, says this is stuff that I'd never seen before. But he can recognize, this is a fragment that has some text from Leviticus on it, another one from the Book of Psalms, and but also frustratingly, he's not paying really close attention to that because he just wants the temple scroll. And if you've seen the temple scroll, you
yes,
understand
magnificent.
why.
Yeah,
I
of
mean, it's a
course.
it's a specimen,
Yeah,
right? So he's kind of like, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar. I look at this stuff all day, every day. I've seen stuff like this before. It's not that interesting, but all of a sudden now, this box of fragments makes an appearance and then it's poof, gone. Um, and then, in 2002, we start hearing about all these manuscript fragments that are trickling out onto the market that, oh, sure. Yeah, this is they all connect. They,
they're
they
all
all
Condo's
came out of
box.
this they all came out of Kando's box, which at this point seems bottomless. It's a never-ending um reservoir resource of material that you need to sell. So but yeah, these are all very tantalizing questions and things to speculate on, and there are still, I was in a documentary a number of years ago that opened with a scene of an archaeologist in Jerusalem who will regularly just walk out into, well, he will drive, but then he will hike up and just map and scour caves on the western shore there because there's thousands of them, and because he's just determined to find
Sure.
some more manuscripts out
Well,
there
you think about the
because
Cave of Letters and Nachachever
yeah,
that
yep.
the letters by Bar Kokhba. I mean, just it's
Oh my god, right?
like
Like,
with
what a
his
find.
maybe with his signature on them. It's mind-boggling
It is,
that we
it
would
is.
find these letters.
So who knows? There's
Well,
gold out there
yeah, that I'm
there,
sure
hey?
the caves, and again, also like it's ditto in Egypt. I was just in Egypt, and the
Oh,
Chakos
yeah, wow.
Codex shows up on the market. Some guy put it in his freezer in the Midwest, damaged it beyond recognition. I mean, it's like my God. We found a mummy just like out in the desert. Just like someone was one of the tour group people was one of the people on the
While you
tour.
were there?
Oh yeah, we.
No.
Oh yeah, we were. One of the people on the tour was out meditating just on the mountain and felt some mojo and looked over and there's a human skull poking up through the ground, looking right at him. Of
That's
course,
amazing.
I mean, he did the right thing. He didn't touch anything, but people talk about archaeological sterile sites, and I'm like, yeah, good
And
luck
we
with.
should we should probably say, I hope it goes without saying, but don't buy antiquities, folks.
Yeah, I mean, and
So,
if you find antiquities, like, call
report
somebody.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah, call
report it.
someone.
Yeah, call someone.
Don't
If
touch
you
it.
yeah, if you find yourself kicking about in a cave in Nahochever and, there's been an earthquake recently and there's a new cave there, report it. Let
Do the
people
right thing.
know. Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of treasures, let's wrap with the Copper Scroll because I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
did a deep dive on it, and I just like to get your 2 cents. Everyone has a theory on the Copper Scroll. Everybody has their pet analysis. But I guess what I would put you on the spot is,
Yeah.
you know, do you
What
think
is
it's
it?
do you think it's
Where did
real?
it
Do
come
you
from?
think where did it come from? What do you think of the treasures? Do you
Yeah.
you know and also sort of where does it seems like the field has largely shifted away from Millick's position that it was a fairy tale, it seems now
Yeah,
that
I
the
think
field
so.
mostly
Like my sense is that everyone is of the opinion that at least this is legitimately a an inventory, a
right.
real inventory of real um uh treasure caches, right? Like it's that's probably what it is. That's what most scholars think it is in terms of those who are still writing about it. So it's the way I approach this question is and one of the things that I think is really interesting just in general is the ways in which these individual caves have been connected to this particular site at Qumran, right?
Mhm.
In the first place, just on the basis of proximity, but then also because there's some interesting intertextual connections, texts that you find in Cave 11 appear in Cave 4, which also appear in Cave 1, which appear in Cave 5 and 6 and 3, right? So, there's this intersection of material which seems to say, well, it must have all come from the same group, the same people. But I think too, you touched on it a little bit earlier, how much of a commitment you need to make to your own health just to make the trip to,
Mm.
from the site to like cave 1 or cave 11 for sure.
It's 2 kilometers
um
away from Qumran, it's a
yeah,
hike.
so cave 3 is even farther.
Right.
Uh, so, like,
Thick.
the way I approach this and that's the other thing too, I don't think all the caves are the same thing. Like, some of them have these big jars in them with manuscripts that have been carefully stored in them. Some of them have, manuscripts that look they were just kinda tossed in there. Cave 4 is really interesting because it looks like it could have been, like, just there library, right? Like that's these caves are functionally different from one another. One of my colleagues at King's College in London, Joan Taylor, has written about Cave One, exploring this question of how much maybe it functioned like a primitive Geniza,
Right, right.
right? Of a
That's over the
storage. Yeah.
people think there was a
So
it was maybe a Jerusalem Geniza. Some of these caves were Geniza from Jerusalem, but that
sure,
seems like a way far away place to put a
but
for a Geniza when
maybe
you have caves right there in Judea, right there in Jerusalem.
certainly, certainly. So I wouldn't she doesn't talk about it in
Yeah.
connection to Jerusalem, but thinks maybe, it served a similar function for the group.
Right,
So for them, even if all of these caves are theirs, we can't treat them all the
right.
same, even from a chronological perspective. Like some of them, were probably used before others. And in terms of just the geography, how confident can we be that they're all connected to Qumran, which is kind of how I approach this question with regards to the Copper Scroll. I think it's important to point out that it's in this cave, which I think has the most tenuous connection to the community. And you look at some of there's not much there. Like in my listing here, I've got so many of these are just unclassified fragments, unidentified text. But of things that we were confident is there. There's a copy of the Book of Jubilees, right? And when I say a copy, I mean like there's there's two tiny fragments from the Book of Jubilees. There's one of the so-called Pesherim there, which is a dubious identification for this particular manuscript because it's just the like it's like just the prologue of the book of Isaiah, and then some fragmentary bits about like Yom HaMishpat is in is in this manuscript, right? So I think it was probably identified as a Pesher on Isaiah based on the fact that it's got the prologue to the book of Isaiah and then something else. So we don't know what that is. And then a hymn, and then a copy of something that looks like it somebody identified it with the Testament of Judah. So just looking at kind of the literary profile of this cave, there's not really anything that directly connects it to Qumran in the same way that some of these other caves do, right? Like we didn't find a copy of the community rule there or the Hodayot or a bunch of these other manuscripts that you might connect closely. So I just like I know that and I think it's a very reasonable case that Puesh has made basically repeated with regards to identifying the copper scroll with the yachad at the site, as uh, their collection of I said Trevor, their collection of treasures, of of riches, and importantly, yeah, they were wealthy, so they had some means. So this seems like it could make some sense. I'm
And at
just
least if we trust Josephus, they held all their wealth in common.
That's
So
right,
so they would
exactly.
have had they would have had a lot of liquidity in the absence
Yeah,
of banks.
yeah.
You just
So I
hide
think
money.
I think that's very I think that's very reasonable. This is very plausible. But it's way out there. There's no direct connection. It could have been from someone else. It
Yeah.
it really could have. Um, now and I think Poesh makes the point as well in his book where he talks about how again on this question of the ways in which we're talking about the Essenes and their connection to the Yachad, there's Essenes in the temple, right? There's people who are undoubtedly closely connected to the site that still have strong connections to the temple. So, we just, I still think it's very likely to me too that this is something that could have come out of the Jerusalem temple.
Mhm.
And if it did, then I have questions with regards to some of these other fragments of manuscripts that we found there. So
Right. Right. It's a puzzling document just in terms of the fact that they're storing stuff in sites that are normally thought to be unclean, and
yeah,
it's
right.
and also
Oh,
and a point also that I didn't make in the video is the fact that there's a Roman camp out there not long after the
yeah.
destruction, and it makes me wonder, what made the Romans don't pitch camp in the middle of nowhere for no reason. What in the world would lead the Romans out into that hinterland? Um, you know,
And it used to be a military site, right?
right,
Like the site was built it was a fortification.
right,
Like so they probably were able to repel invaders for a while at least. It's not like they were completely helpless, setting aside their terrible war strategy. Uh, it's so yeah, there continue to be all sorts of ongoing questions about this, about the copper scroll. I'll say one other thing about the copper scroll, which for me it's a personal, a more it connects to me on a more personal level because I'm a Manchester alum. Um, my Dr. Father George Brooke was uh, friends with John Marco Allegro
hmm,
and knows the family and John Marco Allegro for all his faults has a very nice connection to the Copper Scroll. He's the one
right,
who made it possible for the Copper Scroll to be transported to the University of Manchester, and he
right,
worked with the team at what was then the Manchester Technical School to devise a way to open it and to actually read it. And it was a fun thing. I used to walk by the building and go, oh wow, there's the building where the
cut the
the
copper
copper
scroll
scroll
up.
was open. And then I would go to my supervisor's office for a supervision meeting, and if I had to wait for him, I could play around with the perfect replica of the temple scroll that was made uh, for the University of Manchester at the time that it just before it was opened. Right, he's just got it sitting in his office. So lucky me,
That is pretty cool.
I
You
got to
play with
play
the
around.
facsimile.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I've seen those great videos, the great film that Allegro shot when it was being opened.
yeah, yeah, right.
Man, can
It's
you imagine
incredible.
being the I guess the lathe operator, and your job for today is
Yeah. Don't
to today you're
don't
gonna
mess this
yeah,
up.
don't mess this up. And you do see the great degree of I included some footage from it in the video I did where
Yeah, I thought
uh,
that was phenomenal. I was so happy you did that.
yeah, seeing it being opened up, man, what a you know just watching that footage made
Yeah.
me feel nervous. My goodness. Well, Dr. Kip Davis, I just want to really express my gratitude. We've been on for about 2 hours. You sharing your wisdom on all things Dead Sea Scrolls, and mostly me picking your brain about things I'm interested in. So thank you for indulging me. Um,
This has been
um,
awesome.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And
Again,
I'm not kidding. I could seriously I think you and I could literally sit down and talk all day.
I think we
Um,
could. This is just again, and I have to again be careful, folks. Again, I'm not a Bible scholar, but this stuff just fascinates me to the point where, like,
you
I'm sitting
certainly
there
do
with the
a s
DJD, poring over facsimiles because I'm just like, oh, was that in the poo wall?
you
Um,
certainly do a strong impersonation of a Bible scholar,
I play one on
I have to
TV.
say.
Uh,
You're
play one.
you're the only one who plays one on TV, seriously. So, but
um,
yeah,
Well, Dr. Kip
well,
Davis, thank you so much for coming on. Where can folks find you? If you're interested in Hebrew Bible and Dead Sea Scroll material, Dr. Davis is producing fantastic content.
thank you.
I'm really glad that you're part of the Religion Tube ecosystem, really doing the a saint's work of dispelling a lot of nonsense that's out here on the YouTubes, but also doing fine work educating in your field as well. So where can folks find you?
Thank you very much. Yes, my YouTube channel is my name, Kip Davis. And yeah, I am usually live once a week. I'm trying to do a lot more live stuff, and I've been doing more recently, and I plan to do a lot more of these interviews with active scholars in the field. I just had, last month I published an interview that my colleague, Dr. Joshua Bowen at Digital Hammurabi, and I did with archaeologist Amahai Mazar. Dr. David Carr from Union Seminary was just on my channel talking about the formation of the Pentateuch. Dr. Erin Thompson was on my channel yesterday talking about her work in forged antiquities,
Mhm.
and there's more coming. You're going to be on my channel
Yeah, I'm going to be on in a couple
in the
weeks.
coming weeks, which I'm very excited about. So I've got a raft of people that I want to introduce to the world that are within my world, within our world, and I'm continuing to work away on my long form series on the Dead Sea Scrolls and just topics of interest to me. I've got a video about the Tower of Babel. I've got some other videos about things like one that we didn't even talk about, the Psalm 22, the famous crucifixion psalm, and
Mhm.
and the ways in which the Dead Sea Scrolls have contributed to the textual conversation of that psalm, and in many ways I think been abused and misunderstood by Christian apologists. So that's a lot of what I do. I teach a course. I teach online courses in Hebrew. I have an online course on Israelite religion. I'm in the process of writing and nearly finishing a book developed from the course on Israelite religion. And yeah, I think that's just about it. So I do a lot of this kind of content on social media, and I'm just trying to, as best as I can, help people to understand and help people to get excited about the Bible and about critical biblical scholarship.
Yep, I'm about it, man. Yeah, folks, if you want to learn biblical Hebrew, take a class with Kip. Again, I
Doc,
always encourage
did
people get primary languages, folks.
Yeah.
I beat this drum constantly.
I'm working with Digital Hammurabi on that. He's set up an entire platform where you can learn Biblical Hebrew, you can learn Sumerian, you can learn Middle Egyptian.
Yeah,
Akkadian is coming.
Nice.
We're probably going to start offering Aramaic in the near future here too.
Nice.
There's all sorts of stuff
Yeah,
that you can do.
these languages are not magical, folks. They're just languages. They're
Nope.
not hard. Hebrew's not hard. Akkadian is not that hard. These languages, like literally, I read enough Egyptian that I was this the content coming out this week is only coming out because I was in a tomb in Middle Egypt, and I just happened to look at a column and thought, hold on, that guy is talking to me, and I see the word way of God and way of life
Oh,
in
phenomenal.
Egyptian,
Wow.
and I'm like, this is weird, and there's a whole episode coming out from the
Oh,
tomb of
that's very cool.
Cyrus, and it's only because
Oh,
I
I'm
read
excited.
a little bit of again a little bit of Middle Egyptian, but enough to be able to like
Enough
say,
to make
hold
you
on,
dangerous.
something is going weird. Yeah, definitely enough to make me dangerous for myself. Enough for me to know when I need to go read
Yeah, yeah,
legitimate
yeah.
Egyptologists.
Oh,
um,
absolutely.
so, well, folks, again, if you've liked my videos on Yahweh or the Ketephenom amulets, and I've done some episodes on astrological and exorcistic literature found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you like that stuff,
Brilliant.
again, folks, I'm a tourist. Go to the experts. Go to folks like Kip, and check out Dr. Davis's channel. You're going to get a lot better content there. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come hang out with me and chat about Dead Sea Scrolls stuff, man. Thank you.
Loved it.
All right,
Awesome.
folks.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, folks. And again, make sure you go subscribe to Dr. Davis's channel. There'll be a link in the description below.